Okay, we're looking at Twangstrom, created by Yuhi. This is a spring reverb effect. It is not using convolution or impulse responses. It is strictly modeled algorithmic spring reverb. So before we start, I'm going to enlarge this. You can right click on any part of the blank interface where there's not a control, and you can boost the size of this. So, basic quick overview of the controls. There's an input, there's a drive, tone control, you have a filter section, pre or post. So post will work on the reverb signal itself. Pre is going to just filter the sound on the input before it hits the springs. You have a low pass through to a notch, through to high pass, or the notch is also a band pass, which is what I use more often. It's pretty handy to have that be able to change from notch to band pass. Frequency is the cutoff, stereo effect on the filter. Also resonance, which will increase frequencies at the cutoff point and give you a more pronounced sound through to a very resonant effect. Or you can also use it just to kind of dial in a little bit of extra frequency rate there, almost like an EQ when you use it in smaller amounts. It just gives you a little boost based on where you're cut off. Then we have the width. It defaults to 100. I'm going to turn this down to 0. I'm using it on a snare, and to stay in line with more classic vintage sounds, it's going to be, I want it in mono, which is the way most spring reverbs are. There are some stereo units, but truth is, bulk of it that you hear is usually a mono effect. Mix defaults to 50. I'm going to turn it up to 100 because I don't want any of the dry sound coming through. I'm using it as a send effect, so I want only the reverb sound coming out of this alone. The output, and there's a soft clip, so if you're really pushing this thing hard, the soft clip is handy to help prevent you actually getting digital distortion on the output. You can control the decay time, the tension on the springs, the density of the springs. If you want more sproing in your spring, these two controls will give it to you. You have coupling on or off, which ties the springs together. I'm going to turn that on. There's a bright on or off. I'm going to leave it off for this. Bright just adds a little bit more high end, depending on the sound you're using and how you have it filtered. That will affect how much you really hear that. Now we have a modulation section down here. There's an envelope, and it can work on the input, and you can control how it works. There's a cycle, which would be more like an LFO, attack release, attack decay, and just an envelope follower. And it can work on the input. It can be an external source, so you can be triggering this envelope with another track and making the spring effect go how you want. It could be a track you're not even using in the song. It could be a muted track, but you can send it to the effect, and you can use it to sidechain and agitate the springs. Or the output of the unit itself can be used to run the envelope. Okay, here's this where you choose a source for your modulation. So I could pick the LFO and choose a target. You just click and drag to something and let it go. I'm going to drag it right here. I'll show this in a second. And the LFO controls itself, different waveforms and the speed. This controls whether the modulation is on or off for each slot, and the amount, positive or negative. There's also an amp modulation here. You have the same sources to choose from, and the depth control over here that will control really the output, so you could make like a tremolo on this thing if you want to. Right here, this window in the middle, we have a control over the type of tank that you're using. There's 3 classic types of tanks, and they modeled the 3 of them in here. Type 4 is a 2-spring tank. Type 8 is a 3-spring tank. Both of those tanks are long. standard size, and Type 9 is a short tank, 3 springs. Now each tank also comes in 3 lengths of reverb time. They come short, medium, and long, but here we just have a decay knob that covers beyond the realm of normal tanks to longer or shorter than the short, longer than the long. So they don't need to really model them exactly. They give us flexibility with the decay knob here. So the last thing you have is a really nice feature. There's a shake control, and you can assign that to a MIDI controller. So while you're mixing, you know, if you're doing some dub mixing, you can have control over that with a knob on your controller and bring that shake in anytime you want. So right now I've assigned the LFO to the shake. Let's put this on a square wave so that we get a hard hit on it, and I'm going to turn up the modulation amount. All right, so that is just the sound of the springs itself right there. Just the springs being agitated. No sound was making it, no sound was going through it. It's just the LFO was shaking the springs. Okay, so let's hear this. I have it set up for a snare, as I mentioned earlier, and let's play it. We'll mess with the frequency a bit and the filter types, and then we'll set it up for the sound that we want on this snare. So you can hear right there how you can use this as a reverb. Springs are generally dark sounding reverb units, so that's why it sounded so dark to begin with. That's normal, but as you bring in the band pass, cut the frequency down a bit and boost the resonance, you're hearing quite a difference in the sound. Let's try the high pass here, see how that sounds. I'm going to start with it all the way down so you get the full signal coming through, and we'll sweep it up. Then I'm going to change over to pre, and we'll hear the difference on how that works. You're not going to hear the effect sweeping. It's just going to change the way it sounds with every hit. Whereas right now, as I move the frequency, you're hearing it sweep the actual reverb itself. Right, so it's important to understand how that works and for the effect you want in your mix. If you're going to be playing the reverb as, say, part of a dub mix, you're going to be messing with the frequency. You want to know if you want the sweep sound in or not, or if you just want it to sound different on every hit as you're sweeping the frequency. In which case you use pre. If you want to hear the effect on the reverb itself, you want to hear that whoosh, that whooshy sound, you put it on post. So a lot of times I will set this up and I'll have the resonance, you know, kicked in somewhat to boost a little bit of the frequency somewhere along the lines. I use a mix of high pass and band pass a lot. So I will set it up like that. And if I'm going to play the reverb, I will have knobs assigned to the frequency and to the resonance. I'll boost that resonance and then start sweeping the frequency around. So it gets a little more pronounced on the hits. All right, so I think that demos that pretty well. Let's adjust the tension and density here, show you how that affects the sound. So if you want to use this purely as an effect, not as the main reverb, let's say you can set up two of these. You can have one as the main reverb, and you can have another one just to set it up all floppy sounding and loose and just smack some hits on that. Likewise, you can also assign controllers to these and just adjust them in your mix and, you know, put them back to 0 afterwards or wherever you wanted them sounding for the main reverb. So you can really control a lot of the sound that you get out of this thing. I'm going to set it up now for the sound that we want on this snare, and then we'll move on to some other instruments with another instance of the plugin. Okay, just before we move on, let's assign this LFO to the frequency and just show you how it works here. We're going to go to a triangle wave so that we get a smoother moving thing instead of something that's stepping. We'll go over to a random afterwards as well and use that. So it's assigned to the frequency. I'm going to turn up the amount here and turn up the resonance so that it accentuates it a bit more. So again, you have total control over that. You leave it on pre and you're just hearing it change the sound on every hit. You put it on post and you're hearing it sweep the actual reverb sound itself. So let's just set this back close to where we had it. Just turned it down a bit. It was much, I had it up high just to demonstrate it so you could hear the effect good there. And let's turn on the bass and the mute guitar, and we're gonna add this effect into that to that muted guitar. Even though it's not really a high level being sent to it, it's very noticeable still. Lets that sit in, gives it a vintage kind of vibe. And let's move on to the piano and the guitar. And we're going to set up that reverb. Let me enlarge this again. This is a different instance, that's why I had to change the size, and both of them were preloaded. So I think once you change the size, if you leave it there, you boot up again. Any new one you install, you know, defaults to that bigger size. Gonna turn on the organ. I'm gonna use the same one, the mono reverb that I had set up on the snare for this as well. Let's see how it sounds. All right, let's switch back and forth between the stereo and the mono on the organ here, just so you can hear the difference between them. We'll start off with the stereo one, and then we'll pop back and forth between them a couple times. So it comes down to the effect that you want, the sound that you want to give. I'm leaving it on the mono one for this. It sounds a little more vintage. And on the piano and the guitar. I'm leaving the stereo version on there. Let's play the track with all of those reverbs engaged, and I'm going to mute the reverbs on and off here, and we'll see, you know, the impact that it has to the sound overall. So there you have it. That is the basic sound of Twangstrom. I mean, this would be fine-tuned and tweaked a bit more for a final mix, but generally that's it. You know, you might adjust the levels a bit, adjust the frequency, or add a little EQ after them even to dial them in. But you can certainly hear a big difference between with and without them. So this is my go-to in-the-box spring reverb. There are other options out there. Some of them I've tried, some of them I haven't. But if you're interested in a spring reverb in the box, if you don't have one, you're looking for that sound, this definitely gives you the sound and all kinds of control over it. And you get the modulation matrix as well, where you can modify things. And not all of them have a shake control, so it's a definite good feature to have. So that's it. That's Twangstrom. You can get a free demo if you're interested in it. Download it, try it out for yourself on your own stuff, see whether you like it or not. Thanks for checking out the video. That has been Yuhi Twangstrom. How you mean?